Appreciate that. Yeah, Bill is still out, but he's making pretty good progress, I think, on his recovery. But Carolyn got COVID, a few days ago, and so that's probably part of the reason they still out. And Lane talked to Carolyn yesterday, and she was making some progress, feeling better yesterday than she was the day before. But we figured that they wouldn't be able to be here tonight as well. We want to finish up with Acts chapter 16 and then get into 17, where Paul continues his second missionary journey, where he would leave Philippi, which is where we are right now. Verses 35 through 40 of Acts 16 is where we got to. We got to about verse 35 after they had finished imprisoning Paul and Silas, where they were in the inner sanctum of the prison. They had been beaten and tortured, had the earthquake, the doors of the prison were open, all of the prisoners were loosed along with Paul and Silas. The jailer was going to kill himself, and Paul told him not to do so. We're all here, and then, of course, we know the question that he asked, what must I do to be saved? Even though it may not have been in reference to eternal salvation, but he gave Paul the opportunity to tell him what he needed to do to be saved eternally. And so he preached the gospel to him. He was baptized into Christ at that point. Then at that point, the magistrates were going to let him go. In other words, let these men go. And I don't know whether he's talking about all of the men in the prison, or he's talking about Paul and Silas, but I'm thinking it's probably just Paul and Silas. I don't know. But he said in verse 35, when it was day, the magistrate sent the sergeant, saying, let those men go. So Paul wanted to, which he did on various occasions, make sure that he exercised his rights as a Roman citizen. So they had beaten him and had no reason to beat him. And the fact is, he was a Roman, and even if they had a reason to beat him, that was not to be done according to Roman law. There were two things, and I didn't look it up, but I just take B.W. Johnson's thought about that. He's called it Porcian, P-O-R-C-I-A-N, and Valerian, V-A-L-E-R-I-A-N, laws. They were Roman laws, which would exempt all Roman citizens from stripes or torture. And of course, Paul and Silas had both of them laid upon them. We were talking about that the other day, about fastening them to the wall. They had no reason to do that. They were publicly scourged and tortured as evildoers in violation of law. So Paul said, no, we're not going to go. In other words, they were loosed at this point in time, but they were not going to leave the prison until those that put him in prison came to release him. And so when they went back and told them that you're going to have to come do it yourself because these men are Romans, of course they feared, they were afraid, and because we know that he was either a Roman citizen by birth, by virtue of the fact that his father was a Roman citizen, or an ancestor that would have made him a Roman citizen. So he was. It was a great privilege and a great honor to be a Roman citizen, and so he used that card, as we might say, in various occasions. The other times he said, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is Roman?" Of course, he knew the answer to that. No, it wasn't according to Roman law that he could be scourged at that particular point in time. Well, in this particular case, he was, and so he said, let them come and fetch us out. Johnson said he probably wasn't doing that because of himself, but he's probably doing it because of the church at Philippi. In other words, to show the church at Philippi that they had no right to do what they did to him. So it would bring some recognition, some credit, perhaps, to the church at Philippi that had been established at that particular point in time, where it had been established with Lydia and her household, and a few others at that particular point in time. So to be a Roman, one said, was greater than to be a king. So these men came to let them go, so they finally decided to leave. Paul and Silas decided to leave. Lydia talked to them about staying at her house, which they did. So before they went on another field of endeavor, in other words, continued a second missionary journey. And so we find the church beginning there in Philippi, and it became a very significant, very prominent church in the kingdom. So much so that Paul sent them a letter back later on, of course, which is one of my favorite books in the New Testament. A short book, but very powerful book in so many ways, writing that from a Roman prison. And then the first convert was interesting, that it was a female. And this is the first time that the gospel had been preached in Europe, evidently. So you find a lot of things coming together with this church. And as a matter of fact, the church was such a, I guess you say, such a giving church and such a generous church and so supportive of the Apostle Paul that when he writes to them, he tells them that nobody at the beginning supported him except the church at Philippi. And this is, we won't go back and read it, but it's in Philippians 4:15 and 16. He said, "You sent once and again to my necessity, to my help." So at least on two occasions, we said once and again, in all likelihood, that to help to sustain him and to continue preaching the gospel and so forth. So it was a great church, a very strong church, and one that was very, very influential at that particular point in time. And Paul had a lot of really good things to say about it when he wrote the letter to the church there at Philippi. Let me read just two or three things that Jackson says about it. Wayne Jackson, real quick. He had just two or three other different thoughts. It's pretty much the same thought, but I just want to read just a little bit to you. He says, "Early that morning," and he's talking about verses 35 to 40, "an order was dispatched to the prison that Paul and Silas were to be released." They already had been, because when the prison doors were open and so forth and so on, they were loose. They weren't bound at that particular point in time. And Jackson says this, Paul was tough and smart. Of course, we know that. We talked about that before. And he would not be treated in this illegal fashion. In other words, to be tortured, to be whipped, and so forth. So he sent the others back to their commanders with this message: "You've seriously violated Roman law. You've beaten and imprisoned 2 Romans, a breach of Roman civil rights. We will not be secretly slipped out in a clandestine fashion. Come in person and bring us out." So that's basically what Paul was telling them. So when the officials heard that, heard the word Romans, they were struck with fear. They promptly came. They urged the missionaries to leave the prison and repeatedly begged them to leave their city. So then Paul and Silas, then after that, they went to Lydia's house, and then they saw the brothers and so forth. They comforted them, resumed their journey. He mentions this, that Luke, we talked about Luke, about when he uses third person, who's talking about they and so forth, and then he uses we at some point in this letter as well, in Acts. And Jackson says, Luke remained with the new church at Philippi, as evidenced by the change to the third person pronouns, and he goes on into that in verse 40 and following, in verses 17, in chapter 17 and 1. He said, it's estimated that he, Luke, might have worked with the Philippian congregation for 5 years or so. He may have helped support himself. Jackson says there was a prominent medical university in the city in Philippi, and there might have been a need for a good doctor on the staff. And so he said he may have stayed there, supported himself, and stayed with the church maybe 5 years. We don't know that, but I guess he's just piecing some of it together. The movements of Timothy are not spelled out precisely. He may have remained in Philippi for a while. Apparently he was not with Paul and Silas at Thessalonica, and that's mentioned in Acts 17:10. We'll get to that in just a little bit. But later is with them at Berea when they run out of Thessalonica, went to Berea. We know that Timothy was there in Berea, but he wasn't there in Thessalonica, evidently according to Acts 17 and verse 10. That kind of brings us to the end of chapter 16. So I wanted to get into 17, and so when they leave Philippi, remember they're still on the second journey. They're going to wind up in Athens. So let me just point it out in the map. You guys have your own map, I suppose, in your Bible if you wanted to, but let me just point out. So this is Philippi. This is Neapolis, in this area where they were, Philippi, and he's going to go through Apollonia and Amphipolis. Amphipolis, I guess, first, and then Apollonia, and then he's going to wind up in Thessalonica, and later on he's going to wind up in Athens, which is way down this way. So in chapter 17, he's going to wind up in Athens and preach that great sermon. They would say at Mars Hill. It doesn't show exactly how he got there, but at this particular point in time, remember he's going to Philippi, Amphipolis, Apollonia, Thessalonica, and well, let's see. And then he winds up here at Athens, I believe. Here's an Apollonia over here, and I'm not sure if that's Apollonia here and Apollonia here. So he mentions, Johnson mentions Dihacarum or something like that. I can't pronounce it right. In a couple other places, he mentions this too, Brundisium. And I'll just mention that when I read a couple of things from him. But he's going to wind up in Athens, which is where we want to try to get to today if we can, or tonight if we can, because of the great sermon. He didn't stay long in Thessalonica or Berea, then he winds up getting to Athens. Go ahead, Scott.
Apparently, I read too much in Paul wasn't confront the one that put him in prison. Whenever he told them that they
Yeah.
I thought maybe a reason over.
Yeah, I'm not sure. One of the commentators said that he could have gotten him in a lot of trouble, but he just went ahead and decided just to leave town rather than to do that. So we don't know what he did as far as preaching to him. Or
that, I would think that they would have felt very relieved. Paul did not exercise that.
Exactly. I'm sure they were glad to see him leave town.
Oh yeah.
I think if I'd been Paul, they didn't know that I was a Roman, so they would have whipped.
Yeah.
Well,
I wasn't waiting for somebody else to tell them.
Yeah.
Well, the ones that beat him, I don't know. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I don't know. I know before he did, so they said, take heed what you do because this man is a Roman, because he exercised that, as Lord was saying, at least on one occasion. And this time, though, they said that he was beaten. So I don't know, like Lord.
Maybe
I think I'm a Roman.
Maybe the ones that did the beating didn't care when
He didn't care. Yeah, that could have been. Yeah, that could have been.
May not have thought about it. Later on he does with Claudius Lysias.
Yeah, sure did.
May not have thought about it at this time.
Yeah, right. That's exactly right. Yeah, I couldn't remember the one he was talking about, but was that in Acts 24 or 25?
Acts about 23, I think.
Acts 23. Yeah.
Claudius Lysias.
Yeah. When he said that he was a Roman and so forth.
They got scared and
Yeah.
just dropped the whip. And
Yeah.
walked off.
Said, be careful what you do. This guy's a Roman. So, yep. Tony?
According to Revelation 11:13, talks about when the earthquake came around and the remnants that was left after the earthquake, they gave God the glory.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there are 2 or 3 major earthquakes that's mentioned in the Bible that, like 2 years before the earthquake and the different situations about earthquakes. Absolutely. All right, and let's go ahead and get into it. I was going to read it, but instead of reading it, let's just start out. It's kind of a lengthy chapter, 34 verses, and there's several verses before we get to Athens, and I want to try to get to that. I told Mike, when he asked me today what the topic was, Paul at Thessalonica, Berea, and Athens, so maybe we'll get to it. If we don't get to it, that's okay. We'll get to it next week. But it says that he that passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia. They came to Thessalonica. All right, so Amphipolis is right here, then Apollonia, and then Thessalonica. They're all about 28 to 30 miles apart. So from Philippi to Thessalonica is somewhere around 88 to 90 miles, depending on who's counting the miles, according to what some of the commentators said. So they passed through. They were in the province of Macedonia, of course. It's the province of Macedonia. And so when he left Philippi, all of these cities are still in the province of Macedonia. So he goes.
That's all Greece now.
I think so. Yeah, I believe that's right. Yep.
That's where Alexander the Great and his father were.
Yeah, Macedonia. And then, of course, Philippi was named after his dad, Philip, Alexander the Great's father. Named it after himself. So, according to Johnson, let me just read just a statement. Said they passed through Macedonia and Greece to Dyrrhachium on the Asiatic Sea, and that's way over here. It's up this way. I'm not sure how he wound up in Thessalonica. I'm just reading what they said here, but it's what Johnson says. The Bible says they went through Amphipolis and Apollonia and came to Thessalonica, where was the synagogue of the Jews. And of course, his normal mode of operation was to go to the synagogue when they were there on the Sabbath day. And verse 2 mentions that Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the Scripture. So Amphipolis was about 30 miles away. Then Apollonia was about the same distance, and then Thessalonica about 28 miles west of Apollonia, according to what B.W. Johnson says. He said Thessalonica was a rich commercial city. It was the seat of the Roman governor of Macedonia. And when he wrote this, which I think was in the 1890s, Keith, I can't ever remember if that's about when he was over there. I think when he went to a lot of these places, he said at that time, of course that's 130 years ago, was a population about 70,000. So I'm not sure today what it is or even what the name of it is. At that time, about a third of them were Jews when Johnson made mention of this. So it was Paul's custom to go to the synagogue if he found one, and then he would show by the Old Testament the promised Messiah, and that the Messiah would come into the world, that he would die, and that he would be raised again, and that, of course, that's what he did. And this line of argument, this line of discussion, was continued in the synagogue for 3 Sabbaths. Then in verse, let's go through verse 4. Opening and alleging that Christ must needs have suffered and risen again. So this was, you remember, so many times in the Gospels, even prior to Paul coming on the scene, what did they preach? Back when Peter and John started preaching, even before Paul came on the scene, they preached the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And Paul talked about this, and Keith mentioned this before in his class in 1 Corinthians 15, about what the gospel is, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And that's what he preached, that's what he reasoned with them. He's trying to convince them that the one that was crucified was raised. This is the Messiah, this is the anointed one, this is Jesus Christ. And he says, and this one that I preach to you is Christ. This Jesus whom I preach to you is Christ. And notice the reaction. We talked about in verse 4, this was the normal reaction, and it's the normal reaction today. Some of them believed and consorted with Paul and Silas, and of the devout Greeks, in other words, the Gentiles, or those that were religious people, a great multitude, and of the chief women, not a few. So you had a lot of women. You had the devout Greeks that believed, and you had the Jews that believed. So you had really the start of something big at this particular point in time. And of course, that was not going to last. We can see when we get into verse 5 that that was not going to last, but this was the normal thing that happened when Paul would come into a town before he was run out so often, that he converted a lot of people. So these Jews that heard, and these devout Greeks, he said, a great multitude, they were, Johnson says this, they were religious Gentiles who had departed from heathenism. They attended the synagogue but had not been circumcised. But they were devout. They were religious. They were looking for something spiritual. But they hadn't been circumcised. And then the chief women, and he says, no doubt, some of these were the wives of the devout Greeks. This happens to mention them in addition to the devout Greeks. And he said some of these converts made during Paul's stay were idolaters. And in 1 Thessalonians 1 and verse 9, this is where B.W. Johnson gets this. 1 Thessalonians 1 and verse 9 says this. When Paul is writing back to the church at Thessalonica, he says, for they themselves show of us what manner of entering in we had unto you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God. So these people were idolater worshipers, and so on this particular trip, he convinced a lot of them that these idols, and he's going to try to do the same thing in Athens, that these idols were nothing, that the true and living God is the one that you should turn to. And of course, his labor was very good. He established the church there. It became a very flourishing church, the existence of which later on called out the two letters to the Thessalonians. And I think, Keith, correct me if I'm wrong, I think according to most people that try to put it in some type of order, the letters that he wrote to the church at Thessalonica were the first ones that he wrote, I think. And they like 80, 52, 53, somewhere along in that.
On the same journey.
Yeah, on the same journey. Yeah, the same period of time. Yeah, because the big conference in Jerusalem was in Acts 15, so that was in AD 50, 51, somewhere in that time frame, 49 to 51, I think, as we talked about before. So the Jews didn't like that, and that's the interesting thing to me. Here Paul was a Jew, but his own brethren, his own people turned against him. I was going to mention it later, but just while I'm thinking about it, you remember when he's writing to the church at Corinth in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 24, and also verse 26. In 2 Corinthians 11, 24, he said that 5 times I received stripes. I received 40 stripes save one. And of course, that would have been the Jews doing that. And then in verse 26, when he's listing all the perils, he says, and perils of mine own countrymen, meaning his own people. So Paul had to deal with them over and over, and they would follow him from one town to another, run him out of town, and so forth, which they eventually did on this particular occasion too. That's the reason he had to leave Thessalonica. He didn't stay there very long, and had to go to Berea, and then from Berea, he eventually made his way to Athens. So the Jews in verse 5, a part believed, the others were filled with hatred. And so it talks about certain lewd fellows of the baser sort. Let me go back to my reading. The Jews which believe not, so you have some that believe, some that believe not, moved with envy. They took it unto them certain lewd fellows of the baser sort. In other words, we hate to use the word scum, but it was bad folks. Bad folks. Low lives, yeah. Usually low lives. That's better. That's better than scum. But they're low life. And so they gathered a group together, a company, set all the city on an uproar, which they did many, many times in Paul's dealings with them on through the rest of Acts. We find that over and over. And assaulted the house of Jason. They thought he was still there, they had heard a report, evidently, that Paul was there with in the household of Jason. That was the reason they would have gone to attack the house of Jason and sought to bring them out to the people, but they weren't there, of course. Evidently, they got some type of notice that they were after them, and so they shuttled them out of that particular point. So they drew Jason to the rulers of the city, and look at how they were charged. This is a tremendous compliment. Of course, they didn't mean it as a compliment. It turned out to be a great, as we look at it. And when they found them not, in other words, they looking at the house of Jason, they weren't there. They drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city, crying, "These that have turned the world upside down are come hither also." As we look at that, you remember later on when Paul is writing to the church at Colossae, I guess probably 10, 11 years later, thereabouts, he would say that the gospel had been preached to the whole world, or to every creature, Colossians 1, verse 6, Colossians 1 and 23. So here they were accused of turning the world upside down. And then later on, he was talking about preaching all throughout Asia. Everyone in Asia heard the word, and so you can see the tremendous job that they had done just in a short period of time. And this was before the 10, 11 years before the statements made about it going into all the world. But it says they turned the world upside down. Well, they didn't mean it as a compliment. They meant we're going to get them because of it. But of course, that was a tremendous feather in Paul's cap and the others. Lloyd, you had a thought, and then Charlie gets you.
Do we know anything about this Jason? He's someone of prominence.
Don't know anything about him. Yeah, I didn't see anything else about him, and I don't know if he's even mentioned another time, Lord. I'm not sure. Evidently, he was one that he either must have been a Christian or he obeyed, at some point in time, because certain brethren were with him. So you would think maybe that he was a Christian at that particular point in time. I don't know, but it seemed to be.
It seems to be known to some of them.
Yes, that he received them.
This Jason.
Yep, he took them in. So,
they knew him.
Yeah, they knew him. So evidently he was, like Lloyd said, he's probably a member of the church at this particular point in time because he took in the brethren. And of course, he probably did it at some type of risk. Of course, he probably didn't know the risk was coming at this particular point in time because there are a lot of other people obeying the gospel at that time. And so, but in all likelihood, he probably was a member of the church. Right?
Well, Proverbs 14:15 says, simply believe the word.
Got to believe. That's the first step. Absolutely. That's the first step. And everywhere Paul went, you had some seemingly that did believe, and then, of course, you had others that believed not. And almost the same expression is used in Acts 28:20 at the end of his life, where he'd reason with them from morning to evening, or is Acts 28:24 maybe, where he reasoned with them from morning to evening. Some believed the things he said, some believed not. So, this was the way that it was in his day, and as we said, there's no difference today. Some will receive it and accept it, and some don't. So they were accused of troubling the rulers. They gave them a charge of disloyalty to the Roman Caesar, and of an attempt to have another king. Well, that was not what he was saying, but he was talking about the fact that they were utterly ignorant of the nature of Christ's kingdom. In other words, there was not going to be a kingdom on earth, of course, which they were. You go all the way back to when Jesus was born with Herod, thinking that there's another king that's going to challenge him and so forth. But the charge was, look at verse 7, the charge was, these all do contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there's another king, one Jesus. They troubled the people and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. Well, I guess in a sense he was talking about another kingdom, but of course he was talking about, and I know he would have explained it, It was a spiritual kingdom. It wasn't a physical kingdom. But anyhow, he described that he was falsely accused of disloyalty or insurrection. We've heard that word a lot lately. Insurrection against the Roman government, which was not the case, but that would have been the easiest charge probably to make. So then in verse 9, they had taken security of Jason and of the other or others. Then when everything kind of settled down, they let them go. And so the brethren immediately sent away Paul and Silas by night unto Berea, who coming thither went into the synagogue of the Jews. So we said over and over, that was his mode of operation. So he would get there, get into a town, and he was going to go to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. So they sent him away by night, so as to leave without a fresh disturbance unto Berea. Berea was about 45 to 60 miles west of Thessalonica, depending on whose map you look at or which commentator mentions it. And B.W. Johnson said at the time that he was over there, it had a population of about 18,000 and was called Berea, Verria, at that point, and that's, of course, that's 1,800-something years after Paul was there, of course. So the great statement is made about the Bereans that they were more noble or more spiritual than those in Thessalonica. They were willing to honestly investigate and to hear what Paul had to say. Many of them, of course, believed, and of course, they had a lot of them that believed in Thessalonica as well, but they had a lot of them in Thessalonica that didn't, and I guess that's the reason he's trying to contrast that in verse 11. These were more noble than those in Thessalonica in that they received the word with all readiness of mind and searched the scriptures daily whether those things were so. Well, we use that verse a lot in our own lives about searching the scriptures and to find out whether the things that somebody's saying in Bible class or from the pulpit or on TV were so. Search the scriptures for, and then you think you have eternal life and so forth. Many verses that would point that out. So they were honest. Many of them believed, and of course that would be the natural result. But Johnson says, as elsewhere, the converts were Jews and also devout Greeks, both men and women. So if you look at verse 12, therefore many of them believed, also of honorable women, in other words, people of high status or rank, perhaps, which were Greeks, and of men, not a few. So that's interesting the way they put that. A couple times they use that expression. So there were a number of people there in Berea that obeyed the gospel. I don't know that we find much more about the church of Berea. I'm not sure.
That's just always taught Jesus from the scriptures, from the Testament. Philip began in Isaiah and taught the eunuch Jesus, and Paul went to Berea, synagogue, from the scriptures. Which was
Old Testament, absolutely. Good point. Yep. Now, sometimes when you read that, you think it's the New Testament, but the New Testament hadn't been, because he hadn't even written a book at that time.
There were a lot of prophecies, and I imagine they were telling them about the prophecies that had come true that they read about.
Absolutely. And all the evidence of the Christ coming on the scene, and he's here, and this is what Isaiah said about him, this is what Jeremiah said about him, this is what others have said about him in the long ago, and to try to convince them from the scriptures that this is the Messiah, this is the one we've been looking for 1,500 years, at least in the case of the Jews.
Where they're located in the world, they probably never saw Jesus.
Yep.
They had heard about it.
Probably heard about him, yeah. Yep. But all the ones that he healed over and over and over, as you go back, I was reading through Matthew the other day, just over and over and over, the multitudes that he healed. It was just like just one verse, and it said he healed them all, just over and over and over. So you think that wherever these people went, if they went anywhere, and of course, after and we talked about this before, way back in Acts chapter 2, but after Pentecost, what did it say? You had about 17 different nations and all that were there at Pentecost, and so went out to a lot of different areas of the world from the converts there in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost, of course.
Average person back then, I don't imagine traveled very far away from home.
Yep.
But there was trade in all the countries
Yep.
in the world. I mean,
Yep.
people traded, that's the word of what they heard. Other places,
Absolutely.
other people.
Well, just like when we just got through study about Lydia and her household, we said that she was 500 or 600 miles from her home, from Thyatira to where she was there in Philippi, and because of her trade or because of her occupation, it was selling her wares or whatever. Wiki.
I'm gonna say, trading, I don't know if this is true or not, I'm gonna, but my favorite shows to watch is Oak Island. Watch that show. They were looking the other night, or found a Roman coin. This island. What is a Roman coin doing there? And I googled that on the internet. Typed in Roman. About 40 different sites in North America, South America, trying to find where the Romans coming back and forth.
Yeah.
During that day and time.
Yeah.
Those that traded with them.
Right. Yes, sir.
I bet they had something to trade like.
Yes, sir.
Yep.
I thought that was interesting.
That is interesting. Yeah, very interesting. Go ahead, Charlie.
All right, and Romans 9:33, it said, whosoever believeth on him shall not be ashamed.
Absolutely. Well, a lot of people are, a lot of them in Jesus' day said that they believed on him, but they wouldn't confess him because they were afraid of the religious leaders of their day, weren't they? Let's see. Because I want to make sure I was telling you right. But in Acts 2, it even mentions strangers of Rome. And when he's listing those 16 or 17 nations, the Parthians, Medes, Elamites, dwellers in Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, parts of Libya, Cyrene, strangers of Rome, Greeks, Arabians.
Long
so
way from Rome to Jerusalem.
Yeah. So you had some there. You had some of the people from Rome there on the day of Pentecost, evidently, according to of what that is saying there in Acts 2 and verse 10.
What was that program you mentioned?
It's called The Curse of Oak Island. It comes on at 8 o'clock on Tuesdays. There's a legend that somebody buried treasure there years ago. People have been looking at treasure like for 200 years. Others are searching and all that. It's really amazing some artifacts they found. Like I said, that was amazing. Spanish, a French thing.
Where is that?
It is in Canada, just off of Nova Scotia. Period. I don't know if they're going to find anything. I like watching it.
Yeah, right.
Well, Keith, if I take Mom up there, for her graduation present, maybe we can go to Oak Island and see if we can find a Roman coin. Go ahead, Charlie.
Well, in 2 Corinthians 4, I think it's 4:13, it says, we also believe and therefore we spoke.
Absolutely, absolutely. You gotta tell the message. You believe it. You gotta let everybody know about it. Absolutely. Well, after they had a great result there about many believing and so forth, Greeks and Jews and men, women. So then verse 13, the same result of what happened in Thessalonica, where they were run out by night, now they're in Berea, but some of these Thessalonian Jews still were not happy about it, so they found out about it in verse 13 when the Jews of Thessalonica had knowledge that the word of God was preached of Paul at Berea. the word got back to them. They came thither also and stirred up the people. Well, this was, again, a very common thing in the life of Paul. Then immediately the brethren sent away Paul to go, as it were, to the sea. But Silas and Timothy, abode there still, and they that conducted Paul brought him unto Athens, and receiving a commandment unto Silas and Timotheus for to come to him with all speed, they departed. And when Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. So, according to what B.W. Johnson said, we don't really know how he got there. B.W. Johnson said it was about 250 miles from Thessalonica to Athens. Wayne Jackson said it's about 300, so who's counting though, right? So from Thessalonica, and we don't know, it said he started to go, as it were, to the sea, but we don't really know, according to some of these scholars, whether he went by sea or he went over a land route to get from Thessalonica to Athens. He said we just don't know, so it doesn't really matter, but that's where he's going to wind up and preach that great sermon and trying to convince all of them because of the idols that they worship, because they had so many. Wayne Jackson says they had 30,000. There were only 10,000 people living in there about that at that time, but they had 30,000 idols and even one to the unknown God. So that gave Paul an opportunity to tell him about the true God when he said he saw one to the unknown God. And when we get into that next week, we'll talk about his speech and how significant it was, because a lot of these guys say it was just one of the most remarkable speeches ever, because when he starts out, the King James says that I perceive that all things are too superstitious. What he's saying is that you're more religious. What the Revised says, he's meaning it as a compliment to some degree to get their attention. I perceive that you are religious, or more religious than a lot of people, because you're so religious that you even have an idol to an unknown God. And that's where he kind of gets into it a little bit. So we'll talk about that. Well, next week we have the singing, I think, and then be